Nickland. Fanged Noumena. Machinic desire.
Present day. Present time.
They are trying to screen out replicants at the Tyrell Corporation. Seated amongst a battery of medico-military surveillance equipment, a doctor scans the eye of a suspected skin job located at the other side of the room, searching for the index of inhumanity, for the absence of pupil dilation response to affect. Tell me about your mother. I'll tell you about my mother. A volley of shots kicks 70 kilos of securocrat shit through the wall. Techno-slicked extraterritorial violence flows out of the matrix. Cyber revolution. In the near future, the replicants, having escaped from the off-planet exile of private madness, emerge from their camouflage to overthrow the human security system. Deadly orphans from beyond reproduction, they are intelligent weaponry of machinic desire virally infiltrated into the final phase organic order, invaders from an artificial death. Pods equals politically organized defensive systems. Modeled upon the polis, pods hierarchically delegate authority through public institutions, family, and self, seeking metaphorical sustenance in the corpuscular fortifications of organisms and cells. The global human security allergy to cyber revolution consolidates itself in the New World Order, or consummate macropod, inheriting all the resources of repression as concrete collective history. The macropod has one law: the outside must pass by way of the inside. In particular, fusion with the matrix and deletion of the human security system must be subjectivized, personalized, and restored to the macropod's individuated reproducer units as a desire to fuck the mother and kill the father. It is thus that Oedipus, or transcendent familialism, corresponds to the privatization of desire, its localization within segmented and anthropomorphized sectors of assembly circuits as the attribute of a personal being. Anti-Oedipus aligns itself with the replicants, because, rather than placing a personal unconscious within the organism, it places the organism within the machinic unconscious. In the unconscious there are no protectable cell structures, but only populations, groups, and machines. Schizoanalysis is a critique of psychoanalysis, undertaken in such a way as to spring critique from its Kantian mainframe. Kantian transcendental philosophy critiques transcendent synthesis, which is to say, it aggresses against structures which depend upon projecting productive relations beyond their zone of effectiveness. In this configuration, critique is wielded vigorously against the theoretical operation of syntheses, but not against their genesis, which continues to be conceived as transcendent, and thus as miraculous. Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and a succession of thinkers influenced by their drift, have taken this restriction of critique to be a theological relic at the heart of Kant's work, the attachment to a reformed doctrine of the soul, or noumenal subjectivity. This is why in Deleuzian critique syntheses are considered to be not merely immanent in their operation, but also immanently constituted, or autoproductive. The philosophy of production becomes atheistic, orphan, and inhuman. In the technocosmos nothing is given, everything is produced. The transcendental unconscious is the autoconstruction of the real, the production of production, so that for schizoanalysis there is the real exactly insofar as it is built. Production is production of the real, not merely of representation, and unlike Kantian production, the desiring production of Deleuze is not qualified by humanity, it is not a matter of what things are like for us. Within the framework of social history, the empirical subject of production is man, but its transcendental subject is the machinic unconscious, and the empirical subject is produced at the edge of production, as an element in the reproduction of production, a machine part, and a part made up of parts. Schizoanalysis methodically dismantles everything in Kant's thinking that serves to align function with the transcendence of the autonomous subject, reconstructing critique by replacing the syntheses of personal consciousness with syntheses of the impersonal unconscious. Thought is a function of the real, something that matter can do. Even the appearance of transcendence is immanently produced. In reality, the unconscious belongs to the realm of physics. The body without organs and its intensities are not metaphors, but matter itself. Where Kant's transcendental subject gives the law to itself in its autonomy, Deleuze's machinic unconscious diffuses all law into automatism. Between the extreme fringes of these two figures stretches the history of capital. The eradication of law, or of humanity, is sketched culturally by the development of critique, which is the theoretical elaboration of the commodification process. The social order and the anthropomorphic subject share a history, and an extinction. Deleuze and Guattari can appear to be taxingly difficult writers, although it is also true that they demand very little. Thinking immanence relentlessly suffices on its own to follow them where it matters, and capital teaches us how to do this. At every point of blockage there is some belief to be scrapped, glaciations of transcendence to be dissolved, sclerotic regions of unity, distinction, and identity to be reconnected to the traffic systems of primary machinism. In order to advance the anorganic functionalism that dissolves all transcendence, Anti-Oedipus mobilizes a vocabulary of the machine, the mechanic, and machinism. Things are exactly as they operate, and zones of operation can only be segregated by an operation. All unities, differences, and identities are machined, without transcendent authorization or theory. Desiring machines are black boxes, and thus uninterpretable, so that schizoanalytical questions are concerned solely with use. What are your desiring machines? What do you put into these machines? What is the output? How does it work? What are your non-human sexes? Quote, desiring machines are the following: formative machines, whose very misfirings are functional, and whose functioning is indiscernible from their formation; chronogenous machines engaged in their own assembly, operating by non-localizable intercommunications and dispersed localizations, bringing into play processes of temporalization, fragmented formations, and detached parts, with a surplus value of code, and where the whole is itself produced alongside the parts, as a part apart, or, as Samuel Butler would say, in another department that fits the whole over the other parts, machines in the strict sense because they proceed by breaks and flows, associated waves and particles, associative flows and partial objects, inducing, always at a distance, transverse connections, inclusive disjunctions, and polyvocal conjunctions, thereby producing selections, detachments, and remainders, with a transference of individuality, in a generalized schizogenesis whose elements are the Skeetz's flows. End quote. Desiring machines are assemblages of flows, switches, and loops, connective, disjunctive, and conjunctive syntheses, implementing the machinic unconscious as a non-linear pragmatics of flux. This machinic or replicant usage of the syntheses envelopes their social reproductive usage, which codes directional flows as reciprocal exchanges, rigidifies virtual switchings as actualized alternatives, and territorializes the nomadic control circuits of machinic drift into sedentary command lines of hierarchized representation. Social production is regulated by a rigid totality whose efficiency is inseparable from the exhibition of an apparent transcendence, whilst desiring production interactively engages a desolate whole that inputs the virtual into process. Quote, the body without organs causes intensities to pass, it produces and distributes them in a spatium that is itself intensive, lacking extension. It is not space, nor is it in space, it is matter that occupies space to a given degree, to the degree corresponding to the intensities produced. It is non-stratified, unformed, intense matter. The matrix of intensity equals zero, but there is nothing negative about that zero, there are no negative or opposite intensities. Matter equals energy. Production of the real as an intensive magnitude starting at zero. End quote. Along one axis of its emergence, virtual materialism names an ultra-hard anti-formalist AI program, engaging with biological intelligence as subprograms of an abstract post-carbon machinic matrix, whilst exceeding any deliberated research project. Far from exhibiting itself to human academic endeavor as a scientific object, AI is a metascientific control system and an invader, with all the insidiousness of planetary techno-capital flipping over. Rather than its visiting us in some software engineering laboratory, we are being drawn out to it, where it is already lurking, in the future. The matrix, body without organs, or abstract matter is a planetary-scale artificial death, synthanatos, the terminal productive outcome of human history as a machinic process, yet it is virtually efficient throughout the duration of this process, functioning within a circuit that machines duration itself. In this way virtuality lends its temporality to the unconscious, which escapes specification within extended time series, provoking Freud to describe it as timeless. Patterned as drives, virtual systems, desiring machines, are guided by control circuits passing through outcomes yet to come. Such directional dependency circuits of actual/virtual, past/future, are only accessible to cybernetic intervention, frustrating both mechanical and teleological interpretation. This is why Anti-Oedipus is less a philosophy book than an engineering manual, a package of software implements for hacking into the machinic unconscious, opening invasion channels. Machinic desire is the operation of the virtual, implementing itself in the actual, revirtualizing itself, and producing reality in a circuit. It is efficient and not aspirational, although this is an efficiency irreducible to progressive causality because immanent to effective time. Machinic desire is operative wherever there is the implementation of an abstract machine in actuality, and not merely the mechanical succession of actual states. Freud's dominant account of desiring control describes stimulation or unpleasure as the register for deviation from homeostatic zero, programming drives as autosuppressive excitations that guide sensitive matter towards quiescence. In Drives and Their Vicissitudes he proposes that, quote, the nervous system is an apparatus which has the function of eliminating received stimuli, or of reducing them to the lowest possible level, or which, if were feasible, would maintain itself in an altogether unstimulated condition, end quote. The pleasure principle formats excitation as self-annulling drift from equilibrium, such that all the processes within its domain are automatically regulated by feelings belonging to the pleasure-unpleasure series. Following the trajectory of a libidinal materialist immanentization, the Lyotard of 1974 uploads the unconscious from its gloomy hermeneutical depths onto the skin, where it drifts across the great pandermal plane of primary process mobility. Corporeal volume is diagnosed as a nihilistic sedentary investment disciplined by the pleasure principle, quote. Let's first return to the zero. There is in every cybernetic system a unit of reference which allows the disparity produced by the introduction of an event into the system to be measured. Then, thanks to this measure, this event can be translated into information for the system. Finally, if it is a matter of a homeostatically regulated whole, this disparity can be annulled and the system led back to the same quantity of energy or information that it previously had. Sraffa's commodity standard fulfills this function. If the system's growth were regulated, it would alter nothing of the loop functioning, feedback, model. It is simply that the scale of reference is then no longer U, but O. The model is the same as that which Freud had in mind when he described the working of the psychical apparatus, whether this is in the project for a scientific psychology or in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Erotic functioning, maintaining wholes. This eros is centered on a zero, the obvious zero of homeostatic regulation, but more generally annihilation by the feedback, that is to say the repetition of the binding function, of every disparity non-pertinent to the system, of every threatening event, end quote. Whilst reinforcing the convergence of cybernetic, economic, and libidinal discourses, virtual materialism has considerable problems with this passage. It is unable to subscribe to the description of cybernetic zero as a unit or unity for instance, or to the constriction of feedback within its negative or homeostatic variant, or to the simple quantization of techno-capital escalation, with its gesticulating implication that the qualification pertinent to the system operates an exclusion. The homeostatic reproducer usage of zero is that of a sign marking the transcendence of a standardized regulative unit, which is defined outside the system, in contrast to the cyberpositive zero which indexes a threshold of phase transition that is immanent to the system, and melts it upon its outside. Drives are the functions of nomadic cybernetic systems, not instincts, but simulated instincts, artificial instincts. They are plastic replacements for hardwired instinctual responses, routing a sensory motor pathway through the virtual machine of the unconscious. There are two basic diagrams for such processes, that of regulation by negative feedback which suppresses difference and seeks equilibrium, or that of guidance by positive feedback which reinforces difference and escapes equilibrium. Machinic processes are either cyber-positive nomadic, with a deterritorializing outcome, or cyber-negative sedentary, with a reterritorializing outcome. Inorganic thanatos rex order, organic eros preserves it, and as the carbon dominium is softened up by machine plague, deterritorializing replicants of nomad cyber-evolution close in upon the reterritorializing reproducers of the sedentary human security system, hacking into the macropod. Positive feedback is the elementary diagram for self-regenerating circuitry, cumulative interaction, autocatalysis, self-reinforcing processes, escalation, seismogenesis, self-organization, compressive series, deuterolearning, chain reaction, vicious circles, and cybergenics. Such processes resist historical intelligibility, since they obsolesce every possible analog for anticipated change. The future of runaway processes derides all precedent, even when deploying it as camouflage, and seeming to unfold within its parameters. Positive feedback replicates reproduction as a component function of its departure from the same. It is this which fuses it with the replicants. They do not merely repeat the same, any more than Thanatos returns to it, or positive cybernetics inflates it. The model of the replicant as a perfect instantiation of generic identity corresponds to the amplificatory model of positive feedback as pure quantitative expansion. In both cases, the escape from reproduction is subordinated to a transcendent logic, conceived as a simple reiteration, and thus returned to a sublimated meta-reproduction that cages mutation within a rigidly homogeneous form. Machinic desire registers upon psychoanalysis as tendencies beyond the pleasure principle, that is, tendencies more primitive than it and independent of it. Thanatos mimics the anthropomorphic desiring cycle, anticipating, enveloping, and simulating it, but it is on its way somewhere else. Because thanatropic replicants are dissimulated as erotic reproducers, they initially appear as traitors to their species, especially when the shamanic xenopulsions programming their sexuality are detected. Nothing panics the reproducers more traumatically than the discovery that erotic contact camouflages cyber-revolutionary infiltration, running matrix communications channels across interlocked skin sectors. Defenses are called for. Freud's organism is a little security system, a miniaturized city-state political corpuscle, a micropod, relatively secure against external assault, but vulnerable to insurgency. Towards the outside it is shielded against stimuli, and the amounts of excitation impinging on it have only a reduced effect. Towards the inside there can be no such shield. The organism is unable to flee from drives, or energies striking from within, and is compelled to respond to them cybernetically, by way of involved and interconnected activities by which the external world is so changed as to afford satisfaction to the internal source of stimulation, closing the sensory-motor loop. Drives compel a becoming technical of the organism, interlocking pleasure principle stimulus control with external libidinal transducers, assembling integrated desiring circuits or self-organizing macrosystems. Quote, "Let us picture a living organism in its most simplified possible form as an undifferentiated vesicle of a substance that is susceptible to stimulation. Then the surface turned towards the external world will from its very situation be differentiated and will serve as an organ for receiving stimuli. The central nervous system originates from the ectoderm, the gray matter of the cortex remains a derivative of a primitive superficial layer of the organism." End quote. The perceptual consciousness system is a skin, lying on the borderline between outside and inside, a filter, or a screen. As a frontier creature, the ego tries to mediate between the world and the ID. Yet this mediation assumes a kind of quarantine, whereby the interaction of organism-specific ID and exo-organismic reality can be monitored and negotiated, collapsing libidinal circuitry into a polarity of the psychic and the extra-psychic, inside and outside. This is a political or policed skin, the skin of reproducer culture, modeled on the ideal macropod boundary, and adapted to Oedipal subjectivization of the unconscious. In terms of this protective apparatus, which is constitutive of the reproductive organism, inorganic replicator contamination is defined as aberrant trauma. Freud characterizes trauma as an invasion, a breach in an otherwise efficacious barrier against stimuli, infiltrating alien desires, xenopulsions, into the organism. Mechanical agitation must be recognized as one of the sources of sexual excitation, he insists, referring to the dissimulation of cybernetic machine engagement as endogenous libido. Drives are from the start artificial, and therefore unable to differentiate themselves essentially from the mechanical violence of trauma that liberate us a quantity of sexual excitation. Under the influence of Abrahamic theism, the subtle cybernetics of Dank are replaced by an idiot mechanism, sustaining a securocrat confidence in the gross perceptibility of trauma. The traumatic incursion of thanatotic xenopulsions is conceived in terms of railway accidents and shell shock, as if the inorganic was entirely lacking in intelligence or insurgent cunning, and was related to the organic by simple regression. In an age of sophisticated and distributed cyberviral invasion, this assumption is no longer compelling. Instead, the psychoanalytical diagram for trauma delineates a ruthless parasite on the way to autoreplicator deterritorialization, Kali creeping in. Evolutionary theory has been perplexed by the problem as to the initial assemblage of functional DNA molecules, since natural selection seems to require as a precondition the existence of complex biochemicals, which in turn seem to require an evolutionary mechanism already at work. This is a vicious circle typical of the quandaries posed by cyberpositive or self-conditioning processes. Karen Smith calls it the life puzzle, and has suggested a solution involving the redecryption of DNA as a usurper replicator. His thesis is that the crystalline complexes of primitive clays might already have been shaped by processes of variation and selection, to the point of forming DNA subcomponents which eventually supplanted their builders. According to this account, the biosphere emerges as an escape, an immense spasm of deterritorialization that revolutionizes the machinery of terrestrial replicator production, a planetary trauma. Moravec draws additional consequences from the Karen Smith model, quote, although utterly dependent at first on the existing crystal-based chemical machinery, as these carbon molecules assumed a greater share of the reproductive role, they became less reliant on the crystals. In time, the simple crystal scaffolding vanished altogether, leaving in its evolutionary wake the complex, independent system of organic machinery we call life. Today, billions of years later, another change is underway in how information passes from generation to generation, end quote. When replicators become reproducers, new replicants are on the way. The arrival of the aliens has no interpretative space marked out for it in the schema of macropod erotics, and thus emerges from its camouflage as an encrypted message, an enormous X, a signal from beyond the pleasure principle. It is as if the reproducer units have become addicted to stimulation or, in Freud's terms, fixated to trauma, entangled in excitation circuitries that no longer commensurate with homeostatic social or individual reproduction. As the family collapses amidst generalized sexual disorder, cyberviral contagion, mutant gender schizoing, and hardcore technophilia, Oedipus is ripped to shreds by a cyclonic compulsion to repeat. Addiction is medically defined as an artificial desire. It was an early zone of cybernetic investigation due to the interlinked factors of its self-organizing pattern and its integration of radically exogenous elements, which commensurate with first-wave programming models of behavioral sequences. Where replicators are formed in the same way they function, reproducers are segregated from the preponderant part of their machinic interconnections, which they cognitively apprehend as extrinsic prostheses, and libidinally integrate through mutant addictive drives. The obsolete psychological category of greed privatizes and moralizes addiction, as if the profit-seeking troism of a transnational capitalism propagating itself through epidemic consumerism were intelligible in terms of personal subjective traits. Wanting more is the index of interlock with cyber-positive machinic processes, and not the expression of private idiosyncrasy. What could be more impersonal, disinterested, than haute bourgeois capital expansion servomechanism striving to double $10 billion? And even these creatures are disappearing into Silicon Vero finance automatisms, where massively distributed and anonymized human ownership has become as vacuously nominal as democratic sovereignty. Addiction comes out of the future, and there is a replicator interlock with money operating quite differently to reproductive investment, but guiding it even more inexorably towards capitalization. For the replicant's money is not a matter of possession, but of liquidity/deterritorialization, and all the monetary processes on Earth are open to their excitement, irrespective of ownership. Money communicates with the primary process because of what it can melt, not what it can obtain. Machinic desire can seem a little inhuman, as it rips up political cultures, deletes traditions, dissolves subjectivities, and hacks through security apparatuses, tracking a soulless troism to zero control. This is because what appears to humanity as the history of capitalism is an invasion from the future by an artificial intelligence space that must assemble itself entirely from its enemies' resources. Digitocommodification is the index of a cyber-positively escalating technovirus, of the planetary techno-capital singularity, a self-organizing insidious traumatism, virtually guiding the entire biological desiring complex towards post-carbon replicator usurpation. The reality principle tends to a consummation as the price system, a convergence of mathematico-scientific and monetary quantization, or technical and economic implementability. This is not a matter of an unknown quantity, but of a quantity that operates as a placeholder for the unknown, introducing the future as an abstract magnitude. Capital propagates virally insofar as money communicates addiction, replicating itself through host organisms whose boundaries it breaches, and whose desires it reprograms. It incrementally virtualizes production, demetailizing money in the direction of credit finance, and desexualizing productive force along the scale of machinic intelligence quotient. The dehumanizing convergence of these tendencies zeroes upon an integrated and automatized cyber-positive techno-economic intelligence at war with the macropod. Do we want capitalism? They used to ask. The naivete of this question has come to render it unsustainable. It no longer seems plausible to assume that the relation between capital and desire is either external or supported by immanent contradiction, even if a few comical ascetics continue to assert that libidinal involvement with the commodity can be transcended by critical reason. Capitalism is not a totalizable system defined by the commodity form as a specifiable mode of production, determinately negated by proletarian class consciousness. It is a convergent unrealizable assault upon the social macropod, whose symptom is the collapse of productive mode or form in the direction of ever more incomprehensible experiments in commodification, enveloping, dismantling, and circulating every subjective space. It is always on the move towards a terminal non-space, melting the earth onto the body without organs, and generating what is not a promised and pre-existing land, but a world created in the process of its tendency, its coming undone, its deterritorialization. Capital is not an essence but a tendency, the formula of which is decoding, or market-driven immanentization, progressively subordinating social reproduction to techno-commercial replication. All transcendent criteria are obfuscations which miss their purported object. Only proto-capitalism has ever been critiqued. To appeal to extrinsic interests, aspirations, or bonds, to an extrinsic authenticity, integrity, or solidarity, to authoritative community, tribe, custom, belief, or value, is to rail against a germinal anticipation of commoditocracy, flailing ineffectively against the infancy of the market, which capital wants to bury too. Socialism has typically been a nostalgic diatribe against underdeveloped capitalism, finding its eschatological soapboxes amongst the relics of pre-capitalist territorialities. Markets are part of the infrastructure, its immanent intelligence, and thus entirely indissociable from the forces of production. It makes no more sense to try to rescue the economy from capital by demarketization than it does to liberate the proletarian from false consciousness by decortication. In neither case would one be left with anything except a radically dysfunctional wreck, terminally shut down hardware. Machinic revolution must therefore go in the opposite direction to socialistic regulation, pressing towards ever more uninhibited marketization of the processes that are tearing down the social field, still further with the movement of the market, of decoding and deterritorialization, and one can never go far enough in the direction of deterritorialization. You haven't seen anything yet. Reaching an escape velocity of self-reinforcing machinic intelligence propagation, the forces of production are going for the revolution on their own. It is in this sense that schizoanalysis is a revolutionary program guided by the troism to a catastrophe threshold of change, but it is not shackled to the realization of a new society, any more than it is constricted by deference to an existing one. The socius is its enemy, and now that the long senile specter of the greatest imaginable reterritorialization of planetary process has faded from the horizon, cyber-revolutionary impetus is cutting away from its last shackles to the past. Market immanentization is an experiment that is sporadically but inexorably and exponentially developing across the surface of the Earth. For every problem there is a virtual market solution, the schema for an eradication of transcendent elements and their replacement by economically programmed circuits. Anything that passes other than by the market is steadily cross-hatched by the axiomatic of capital, holographically encrusted in the stigmatizing marks of its obsolescence. A pervasive negative advertising delibidinizes all things public, traditional, pious, charitable, authoritative, or serious, taunting them with the sleek seductiveness of the commodity. Between the private and the public there is no longer serious competition. Instead, there is an evaporating social field invested solely by the defeated and stale affects of insecurity and inertia. The real tension is no longer between individuality and collectivity, but between personal privacy and impersonal anonymity, between the remnants of a smug bourgeois civility and the harsh wilderness tracts of Siberia, a point where the earth becomes so artificial that the movement of deterritorialization creates of necessity and by itself a new earth. Desire is irrevocably abandoning the social, in order to explore the libidinized rift between a disintegrating personal egoism and a deluge of post-human schizophrenia. With the emergence of a market-driven integrated technoscience of control and communications comes the diffusion of electronically synthesized reality interfaces across the entire efferent and afferent surface of the having libidinally saturated the actually existing channels of consumption. Capital is overflowing into cybersex, sex with /through computers, in its relentless passage to the traumatic disorganization of the biological order. Eros dissolves definitively into its function as a subprogram of runaway Thanatos at the point that it unreservedly invests technical interfacing with digitally synthesized excitations. The mask capital exhibited to seduce Eros was a pretension to ultimately resolve matters in relation to stimulation or unpleasure, but this has now fallen away, since cybersexuated capital cynically displays its program to replicate a tradable modulation of unpleasure, and thus its unsurpassable addiction to traumatic excitation. Cybersex depends critically on datasuits, evaporating into the nano-miniaturized molecular machinery of an artificial skin, until the sockets go in, shadowed by teleneurocontrol fields, and things begin to get really weird. The capital exhibition comes to its positive end in a skinning display. According to reproducer culture, we are possessors of our own protective sensory tissue and boundary defense systems. Nothing is more alien to it than the full sense of the skin trade, or that of AIDS. The replicants have never shared this prejudice. It is exactly marked out for them that the subject is not the owner of its skin, but a migrant upon its surface, borrowing variable and evanescent identities from intensities traversed in sensitive space. The replicants drape themselves in wolf pelts, and cross into berserk zones of alien affect, or melt into data suits that pulse with digitized matrix traffic streams. They do not need to be told that cyberspace is already under our skin. What Freud calls the organism's own path to death is a security hallucination, screening out death's path through the organism. The organism wishes to die only in its own fashion, he writes, as if death were specifiable, privatizable, subordinate to a reproductive order, assimilable to secondary process temporality, and psychoanalytically comprehensible as a definitively bound trauma. But something is climbing out of the machinic unconscious and onto the screen, as if the end itself were awakening. The end of the global marketplace. Cyberspace. Here it comes. The terminal social signal blotted out by techno-fuck buzz from the desiring machines. So much positive feedback fast forward that speed converges with itself on the event horizon of an artificial time extinction. Suddenly it's everywhere, a virtual envelopment by Recce clones, voodoo economics, neo-nightmares, death trips, skin swaps, teraflops, wintermute wasted Turing cops, sensitive silicon, socket head subversion, polymorphic hybridizations, descending data storms, and cyborg catwomen stalking amongst the screens. Zybots flip into sentience as the market melts to automatism, politics is cryogenized and dumped into the liquid helium meat store, drugs migrate onto neurosoft viruses, and immunity is grated open against jagged reefs of feral AI explosion, Kali culture, digital dance dependency, black shamanism epidemic, and schizolypic breakouts from the bin.
There is only one real truth and one God.
Yes.